Uhuru, brothers and sisters, comrades. This is Omali Yeshitela. I'm chairman of the African People's Socialist Party. I'm leader of the Uhuru movement and the International African Revolution. I want to thank you for coming on to this discussion on today. As you know, the title of this discussion is Damn the Election, Power to the People. And the reason we're having this discussion that may seem very strange to some people is because the United States government did an incredibly powerful and efficient job of crushing a revolutionary movement of African people in this country and around the world in the 1960s. They assassinated our leaders, beginning with people like Malcolm X, who was the ideological founder of much of what attempts to express itself today as anti-imperialist struggle in the African community. They killed Martin Luther King. They murdered him. The United States government that did this. They were on a rampage all around the world. And they were killing revolutionaries. They were killing people who had moved beyond the civil rights assumption that all the problems could be solved simply by going to vote. I was one of those people who organized in the South to get African people registered to vote. And this was simply to register to join the Democratic Party, which never was a revolutionary organization, never will be a revolutionary organization, notwithstanding the pretensions of Bernie Sanders, who participates in the so-called Democratic Party caucus. But I was one of those who engaged in this struggle to get African people registered to vote. From that perspective and at that time frame, we were trying to catch up with the reality that voting was just one of the obstacles that had been placed before African people to try and attempt to try and make any kind of progress in our lives as a people in this country. And it was a time when throughout the South in particular, the simple whisper or a wrong glance at a white person or from a white person could result in the death of African people, and especially African men in this country. That was a period of extreme terror. White nationalist terror reigned supreme, especially throughout the South, but not only in the southern part of the United States. And so as a part of the response to this, a genuine revolutionary movement began to rise up. And this movement, while at one point expressed itself as a desire, a need to join the Democratic Party, to engage in electoral politics, soon outpaced that. The struggle that we were talking about with the civil rights movement is one that was led by a particular sector of the African community. We call them the African petty bourgeoisie, middle class, what have you. And this was a sector of our population, our community that was aligned with, working with the liberal sector of the white ruling class in this country. And both the liberal sector of the white ruling class and the liberal African petty bourgeoisie had a shared interest in ending Jim Crow and ending the kind of terror that was being waged against African people, the inability of Africans to go to schools, the inability of Africans to work in certain jobs and what have you. And this was because following the Second Imperialist World War, when the United States came out as the most powerful country in the whole world, replacing England as the custodian of the capitalist world economy. When this happened, the United States, after this war, because it was unscathed in terms of war being fought within the United States, unlike England, unlike France, unlike much of Europe, and certainly Japan, which had been destroyed by the United States, much of it, through nuclear weapons, the United States was the one who would now intervene in the colonies that had previously been dominated by Europe. So whereas in the past it was England or it was France that was the primary colonial force stealing resources from Africa, stealing resources from India, stealing resources from various other parts of the world. Now these raw materials were coming to the United States after this war. And we could talk a lot more about how the United States have facilitated that with certain kinds of institutions, the so-called Marshall Plan that came in its wake. But in any event, the United States now is the headquarters of the international monetary system. And through this, the United States now has this problem of solving how to get workers now to be able to escalate the production that has come about as a consequence of the United States getting all these raw materials from former colonies from either existing colonies or former colonies of Europe. And in the past, of course, before this, they would get these workers from Eastern Europe, but now that was impossible because of the rise of the Soviet Union, and much of what they call Eastern Union was part of what they call the Soviet bloc. So the United States had to get workers from someplace, and that place turned out to be the Black community, African people down south. In order to get African people into the factories in the north and to open up factories in the south where African people could be employed by this ruling class, it was necessary to actually wage a powerful struggle to change the relations of production that existed in the South, where African people were employed in extremely intense labor production, and were picking the cotton, building the dams, building the railroads, doing all of the dirty backbreaking work in this country, working for the plantation owners. And Africans were needed by the liberal sector of the white ruling class to work in other factories. And so this is how you had the liberals who engaged in this struggle to escalate the process for civil rights for Black people. They needed us to be free enough to work in the factories in the South that they wanted to open, in the factories of the South that might have already existed. And in the factories, they wanted Africans to be able to leave the South to go to factories in the North. And so this was the basis, this was the material basis for the rise of the civil rights movement, because you had a sector of the African population, the African petty bourgeoisie, liberal middle class forces, who also needed for Africans to be able to vote, also needed Africans to be able to have an education, just like the liberal sector of the ruling class needed Africans to have an education, because to pick cotton and to do all of the dirty work that we were doing up to this point didn't require an education. In fact, an education was dangerous, so they needed us in schools. And so they promoted integration of the schools. They promoted African people being able to have some minimal kind of education. And the African petty bourgeoisie needed us to also be able to vote and participate more in the society, because if we could vote, then the African petty bourgeoisie had a chance of being elected, especially in those areas of the South where Africans often were a majority population. So this resulted in a certain kind of a coalition, an alliance between sectors of the African petty bourgeoisie and the African and the U.S. Liberal sector of the ruling class, and this facilitated the whole revolution from above that was initiated, that called the civil rights movement. And a civil rights movement was based on nonviolence. It had to be based on philosophical nonviolence because they were not taking any chances that the potential for an African picking up a rock or a gun or something like that and waging a serious, genuine struggle that could lead to a revolution. And they wanted to make sure that they were able to constrain and control it. And actually, again, this movement had to be based in philosophical nonviolence. So here you have the basis for the rise of the civil rights movement. And the African working people, the Fannie Lou Hamers and all of the other people who were involved in that struggle were seen simply as pawns to facilitate the interests of both the African petty bourgeoisie and the liberal sector of the white ruling class. And fierce struggles were developed, and I was a part of that. I was one of those who worked in extraordinarily dangerous places in northern Florida and what have you, working to register African people to vote so that they could participate in the electoral process. At the same time this was happening, of course, you can't mobilize thousands and thousands of people. And this was not done without difficulty and extreme danger and violence being imposed on African people. You can't do that. The people cannot get involved in changing the world without themselves becoming changed. And Africans were changed as a consequence of that. So even though the liberal ruling class and the liberal African petty bourgeoisie would have been satisfied with simply getting the right to go to school, the so-called desegregation civil rights bill, and would have been satisfied with the Voting Rights Act that came in 1965, clearly by 1966, Africans were saying that's not enough. And that's when the demand for Black power came about. And so this was transforming this struggle. We had moved beyond the civil rights movement. We were talking about power, Black power. When we said Black power, that put the struggle of African people in this country on the same level of other oppressed peoples around the world who were fighting in Vietnam and other places to have control over their own lives. That's a fight. That was a colonial struggle. That was a struggle against colonialism. And that was the struggle. That is how our struggle had been elevated. And with the elevation of the struggle to colonialism, there's an ongoing contest that was occurring between the nonviolent pacifists and those who were fighting to improve America and those who were fighting to get America off our backs. And Malcolm X, of course, was the biggest champion of that struggle to get America off our backs. But the US government saw that Martin Luther King also represented a profound problem because of the huge number of African people who followed him around the world and inside this country. And should he ever move as he was moving, as he had to move in order to maintain his stature and place in the struggle of our people, they recognized that he was going to be a severe threat. And so King was assassinated. And so here you have won the right to vote, universal suffrage, and at the same time, we're engaged in these battles to vote, to participate in the civil rights process. What happens is the United States government began to assassinate and murder those folk who could take us to our own independent program. And so Malcolm was killed, King was killed. In the 60s, you saw scores. In 1968 alone, I think some more than 30 members of the Black Panther Party assassinated throughout this country, more than 300 thrown in prisons around this country. Mass incarceration was the order of the day. Fred Hampton, of course, was killed in 1969. So you get the right to vote now, but they make sure that they kill those of us and destroy the organizations that would take us beyond simply voting to participate inside the system. They destroyed the anti-colonial movement, and they were quite clear on their objectives. If you look at the counterintelligence document, you will see that that they were clearly concerned about what they call Black nationalist hate groups. Black nationalist hate groups. That is to say, they characterize us as hate groups because just like today, they characterize us as extremists and things like that. But we were hate groups because we wanted to have our own power, our own freedom. And so this movement was crushed by the United States government. Leaders were assassinated, organizations were destroyed, people were pushed into exile, into prisons. We don't even know how many people were imprisoned as a consequence of what the government did at that time. And so at that time, when we had the strong Black Power movement, when we had a strong movement of that was going under the influence of Malcolm X, the philosophy of Malcolm X, when we had a strong movement like the Black Panther Party or the Junta Militant Organization or JOMO, when revolutionary organizations like this emerged and began to fight for our own power, we were not talking about join the Democratic Party. The question of elections, while we may have entertained it, was not the highest priority. The highest priority was the achievement of power for African people. And if an election could somehow contribute to the acquisition of power, then sometimes some of us would participate in an election. But the government destroyed that. And that's why now what we see in this era, there's a retreat back to pre-revolutionary period, to a time where we are supposed to be fighting for civil rights all over again. And the time where the election is the only outcome that people could look for. The government destroyed our own independent organizations. It destroyed those organizations that had viable programs that spoke to the basic and fundamental rights and needs of African people in this country. And then they said, you can vote. You can vote for what? And so here we are today, we find ourselves looking at an election that's going to be happening in November. And this election that's going to be happening in November is for the US presidency. And the contending forces, of course, in this election, the two contending parties, the Democratic and the Republican parties. But we are clear and have been clear for a very long time that the particular parties that we're looking at represent a particular class. There is no working class party on the agenda. There's no working class party on the ballot. There is no revolutionary African political party on the ballot. And all political parties represent a particular class. And that's always been the case. And in the United States, where we have two parties, two ruling parties that represent the same class, that can give the impression, because they split into two, they can give the impression of being about separate and different interests when they're all for the continuing existence of colonial capitalism. They about maintaining the dominance of the United States over the whole world. They are talk about maintaining a social system that fleeces the workers, that work the workers and bleed them dry so that there are never enough resources to feed, clothe, and house our people. And because Africans in particular who live under colonial domination live in a constant state of terror and violence. This is what we are confronted with today. And so we have this election coming up, and you have, on the one hand, you have Trump, who has been quite raw and naked, who is a representative of the Republican Party. And it is the Republican Party that we are talking about. And on the other hand, you have Biden, who is the nice colonialist who represents the Democratic Party. But the truth of the matter is that, again, they represent the same interests. And one thing that people are aware of course, is where Trump stands on most questions. Trump is viciously open about his antipathy to any Black people, to all the other oppressed peoples around the world. He is openly and nakedly opposed to anything that approximates liberation for Black people. He's openly and nakedly united with every effort to keep the Mexican people from crossing that artificial border to recapture their own land, recognizing that half of Mexico was stolen at gunpoint by the United States. There's nothing that Trump says or does that would alleviate the misery that's been imposed on the indigenous peoples in this country who don't even get spoken of most of the time, who living in concentration camps called Indian reservations. Trump doesn't make any bones about not being about or for any of these people. And then with the Biden candidacy, what we have is a sector of the ruling class who has chosen Biden to carry their banner, not because the Democratic Party in general is any different from the Republican Party, but they chose Biden because they had somebody who could be Trump light, like Trump, because he would not be somebody who would offend the moneyed interests of this country and the world, because folk could see that he would not challenge any of the fundamental policies of Trump. He just had a nicer way of talking about oppression and exploitation. In fact, that's how he presents himself in his campaign messages. He is going to be a dignified president. He is going to be somebody who will not make America ashamed, etc. This is the kind of stuff that he's talking about. But you don't hear Biden opposed to what Trump, what the US military, calling itself the police inside this country, are doing to African people. He might speak to a particular case where the murder was so blatant, the oppression and violence are so blatant, so open, that it inflamed the passions of African people who he requires to vote for him. He might say something about it, but he doesn't say Black community control of the police. He doesn't say that there's something wrong with the police in general. He like Trump, he will say there's some bad cops that have to be gotten rid of, but he will not admit that the colonial police, that the police department is an arm of the state whose responsibility, whose task is to maintain the violent control of African people. He won't say that. Biden won't say that. What Biden has done is, again, his responsibility is to be Trump-like. his responsibility is to try to win over as much of the reactionary white base that Trump has, and not to offend those folk, to win over as many of them as he can, especially in what they call the swing states in this country. And what he has done, that is to say, Biden, he has picked this woman, Kamala Harris, this African woman, Kamala Harris, who was a former prosecutor for the state of California and for Alameda and the county in San Francisco, and never had any empathy for any of the people who she was sending off to prison. And in fact, on at least one occasion, intervened to try to make sure that somebody who was in the process of trying to get out of prison because DNA proved that he was innocent, she intervened to try and keep him there by saying that he filed too late. So it didn't matter whether he was guilty or innocent in their view, that is to say what they call guilty or innocent, but he was too late in filing. So you have Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is designed to pick up Black people's vote because they recognize, the government recognized they destroyed most of our organizations. They assassinated most of our leaders. And so from their perspective, and particularly because they work overtime to make sure the masses of African people cannot come into contact with genuine revolutionary leadership inside this country, around the world, then the African masses have only the Democratic Party to turn to. So they turn to Biden, they turn to Kamala Harris, or something to like that. And this is the dilemma that many people find themselves faced with today. They feel like it's a dilemma. They're afraid of Trump. There's this drama that's being contrived on a regular basis to drive people to the polls. Go out and vote to get rid of Trump. They say we can't stand another 4 years of Trump. And on the so-called left in this country, they're talking about how we are moving with Trump toward fascism. Fascism is the worst thing they have ever seen, they say. They point to what happened in Germany. They point to what happened in Spain under fascists. They point to what happened to Italy. But all the time, this was happening in Germany from the so-called fascists, whether it was Hitler, Franco, or Mussolini, their whole colonial world, white world, had African people locked under colonial terror and was committing all kinds of horrific acts and offenses against Black people. So not only were they talked about how bad Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco were, but they don't talk about how the anti-fascists, like the France, who fought against the fascists in Germany on the one hand, on the other hand, they were terrorizing and victimizing people in Vietnam. They were holding our people under colonial domination in Algeria. And of course, all over the continent of Africa, France was a vicious, demonic force that was murdering Black people without stop. And so this is your anti-fascist that they're talking about. And that's how all the fascists were. America fought against the so-called fascists. And at the same time, America was engaged in the struggle against the so-called fascists, then lynching was the national pastime in this country, and Black people were being murdered all over the place. So this is what we're being offered. You gotta fight against fascism. You gotta fight against this bad colonizer versus this good colonizer. Biden is a good colonizer. He's not a bad colonizer like Trump. And so African people, because they're afraid of Trump, and the reason they're afraid is because the government has succeeded in destroying most of our organizations. And most of the so-called leadership have been more than opportunists who are trying to also maintain Africans' presence and struggle within the electoral process. They don't have the courage, they don't have the will or the desire to say you can step out of that process. And that's what we're doing today. We say, damn the election, power to the people. We're saying that what has to happen. And I'm not telling you to tell anybody not to vote. If people feel so terrified and compelled that they have to vote, I heard one leading figure say he's gonna hold his nose and go and vote for Biden. If you feel like you need to put a clothespin on your nose and go vote for Biden, I'm not telling you not to do that. But what I'm saying is this, that we cannot rely on voting for Biden as a solution, that we have to have our own independent solution. Because the question then is, well, what if Trump wins? That's a good question. And the other question that we have is, what if Biden wins? Because Biden is the one that put 100,000 cops in the streets of this country. Biden is the one that made the prison population in this country explode 500% with his so-called crime bill. Trump didn't do that, Biden did it. Both of them are representatives of the same foul social system that keeps African people oppressed. So what you do? What you do is do what we have been doing with the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, with the African People's Socialist Party. And we recognize what had happened to our movement, how our organization, revolution, had been destroyed. And so we said we have to rebuild the revolutionary movement. That's the long-term aim that we have. But in the meantime, what we have to do, we bring as broad a consensus as we can within the liberations movement to say that we have to fight for self-determination. Our struggle is not to get inside the system. I heard Fannie Lou Hamer, who is in Mississippi, and I heard her say that in 1964, she had fought. This was when they called the Freedom Summer in Mississippi. She said, I fought to get into the Democratic Convention. In 1968, 4 years later, she said, I found myself fighting to get out of there, because this is what we have to say. You don't have to be locked in there with them. If you find that you have to make some kind of tactical move, make sure it's a tactical move and not some permanent long-term thing you're fighting for. If you have to make a tactical move, make your strategical move. The objective, the thing that you have to fight for in the long term is self-determination, independence from this system. So here's what we did. The African People's Socialist Party participated in building the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice. And why does it call Black is Back? We say it's Black is Back because you succeeded in killing off revolution. You killed Malcolm, you killed Martin, you killed so many forces, you killed Che Guevara, you killed Lumumba, you overthrew and then killed Nkrumah in Africa. But we're saying we are back, Black is back. And then this is a coalition that involves as many African forces as we could. There's 16 different organizations that members of the Black is Back Coalition. And it's for self-determination. That's what we are for. So we want to create a consensus among the population of African activists that self-determination had to be on the agenda. And that's what we had to be fighting for. And we wanted to win masses of African people to understand this, because if the masses do not understand that we have to be independent, that we have to be self-determining, we will not be self-determined. I don't care how militant you are, how many guns you got. The masses have to be able to unite with that. And that's what we said we would do. And we tried to do this with the coalition. And part of what the coalition did, in 2016, we had several conventions, state conventions in 10 different cities in this country. That's what we did for most of 2016. We had conventions in Houston, Texas, and in St. Petersburg in Florida, and in Huntsville in Alabama, and Washington, D.C., in Baltimore, Maryland, in Newark, New Jersey, in Brooklyn, New York, in Kansas City, Kansas, in St. Louis, Missouri, Chicago, Illinois, and I thought we had one also in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And then on August 13th and 14th, this coalition had a preparatory conference in Philadelphia to build for the convention, the national conference that was held in Washington, D.C. in November. And this conference produced what we call a National Black Political Agenda for Self-Determination. And this National Black Political Agenda for Self-Determination, this was something that was developed before Biden indicated he was going to run for president, before Trump put himself forward. And the point is, this is something that's not being born out of desperation, but out of recognition of what we need as a people. We need to have our own independent capacity to fight for freedom. And so what is happening is that this is what has guided our work, and we want you to unite with this National Black Political Agenda. This is your program, because your program was not presented at the Democratic Convention or the Republican Convention. And uniting with this program, what we're saying that you should do on November 6th through the 8th, that the coalition is having a march, having a rally, having a mobilization. We're going to march on the White House on the 7th of November. And we're going to have a rally at Malcolm X Park on the 7th of November. And on the 8th, we're going to have a conference in Washington, D.C. that's going to revolve around the slogan theme. The slogan theme is Black Power Matters, down with colonialism, Black community control of the police, and you need to be there. I want you, after hearing part of what I've had to say, to agree
to be there. I want you to agree to attend, sign up to attend this conference. Sign up to get the word out in your area. Sign up to organize a contingent from your community, from among your friends and families and organizations that you know. Volunteer to distribute propaganda that can be downloaded from the Black is Back website, and then use other accountable means to propagate this mobilization. You need to be there. Everybody needs to be there. This is something that allows you to do whatever you feel like you might have to do on November 3rd, but it allows you to do what you have to do, what you need to do following that, because we have to have our own political program. No matter who gets elected, we have to have an independent political program that we can fight for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in the entire month and years ahead of us until we win our freedom. We need to be able to come there on November 7th, where the rally and the march is going to happen, and be able to demand US out of Africa. There are US troops all over Africa killing people right now as we have this discussion in secret wars. We need to say the US should stop the support, all the money that's pouring to this illegitimate white nationalist state of Israel that's murdering people, not only in occupied Palestine that they call Israel, but in Africa and other places, and Yemen and Iran. We need to say that the US government must end the economic quarantine of Zimbabwe and Venezuela. We need to say, stop the low intensity warfare being waged against Iran and its people. We need to say something about the colonial immigration policy that some of you hear about when Trump's talking about the wall, but that's not the only thing. Although we say tear the wall down, tear the wall down. The wall is something several hundred years late. They should have had the damn wall when the white man came here. But we need to say, in this hostile, brutal immigration policy that won't even allow Africans from Haiti and from Africa to come into this country. So what we are saying is that we can have our own program. It can be an independent program. You need to start now organizing, and I'm calling on you to get more information, to call the Black is Black Coalition at 786, that's 786-505-9859, 786-505-9859. Come to Washington, DC. Vote with your feet. Vote for power to the people as opposed to power to the pig to control our situation since we were first brought over here at gunpoint. We can win. We can win. We must win. We are winning. Uhuru.